so really excited to be here on a Friday. But I want to start with a story. This is my family. I grew up in a small town in North Dakota, so you might hear my accent come out every once in a while. But I am the daughter of a nurse and the daughter of an electrician. And so growing up, my parents, and the way that I understood work and the way that I understood childcare, really, right? I never went to daycare. My dad worked and traveled as a traveling electrician, so he was gone Mondays through Thursdays, and then my mom worked Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And so I always had a parent home. If for some reason my parents weren't home, both sets of grandparents lived within 5 minutes of our house, and so then and they were all retired when I was growing up, so if something happened, I'd go over to my grandparents' house. And so growing up, I didn't really understand anything about work-life balance, right? As a kid, you never do. You're just like, it's just what it is. And it wasn't until, I went to college, and then I started to work at Microsoft, and I was like, man, this is really weird. At Microsoft, I was a billing specialist, and they would have us bring our computers home with us at night, just in case something happened, and then we could work from home the next day if we needed. And it was just their policy. And I was like, why would I work from home? Right, nurse and electrician, you can't do that work from home. And so I was like, so it was like my brain just doesn't compute. I didn't understand what that was. And a big part of that is I come from the missing middle. And the missing middle is the unmarked social class in the United States. The missing middle are often overlooked in our scholarship and in public policy as well. So in research, I hate how they operationalize it and how they define the missing middle. Neither rich nor poor. Well, what does that mean? But right, these are the people, when I say they're overlooked in policy, right, they're not the people on welfare or food stamps. So they're too rich to kind of qualify for any of those programs, but they're not rich enough to have stocks and to really pay attention to the stock market and maybe some more of those policies that are aimed at more of the higher income bracket. And so in the research, the missing middle are, they typically consider about the 25th percentile to the 70th percentile. And so in the US, it's roughly $25,000 a year to $110,000 a year, which seems like a really wide margin. And to me, that's drastic, right? Because I come from, I'm like, oh my God, I can't imagine not making $100,000 a year. However, if we look in the US, that is actually the middle bracket, is $25,000 to $110,000 a year. For a family of 4, is how they kind of cut it off. The missing middle are considered slightly educated, and so no higher than a bachelor's degree, but a lot of these people might have trade or a 2-year degree, some college, and then maybe they dropped out. So my dad went to college for a year before he failed out. My mom had a 4 years degree as a nurse. And then they tend to be career track, blue collar or white collar workers. So this group is also called the working class. So in the research, you see the terms get used a lot: working class, missing middle. I prefer missing middle because of the theoretical framework that I use. And so throughout today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the common theories underlying my research, and then talk through, it's actually my dissertation project, and so and talk through some of the main findings that I found. But I grew up in the missing middle, as did my husband. This is my husband, Matt, and our daughter, Marin. And so I'm a college professor. I can work from anywhere. As long as I am here basically for office hours and when I have to teach, the university doesn't care when and where I do my work. They don't care where I'm doing my grading. They don't care where I'm doing my lesson planning. They don't care that when or where I'm doing my research, right? Maybe I'm doing it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe I keep 8 to 5. They don't really care as long as I get my work done. And then my husband is a software programmer who works from home. His company is actually out of West Fargo, North Dakota. It's where he first got a job after graduating college, and he has moved with me from place to place that we have moved, and he's just always worked from home. And so our understanding of what workplace flexibility is very different than how we grew up. And my nephew, he's now 12, but it was a couple of years ago. It was when I first got the job here. And he's like, oh, what are you doing? Because he used to call me all the time. Now he's too cool to call me. I'm like, oh, I'm at a coffee shop working. And he goes, well, we have coffee shops here. Why can't you move back home? And I'm like, what? Oh, he thinks like I actually work at a coffee, like, right, working at a coffee shop to hit, like, it was this mind-blowing experience. And I was like, it's because he knows nothing else, right? His dad is a farmhand. And his mom, well, she started a new job, but at that time she was a paraprofessional educator, right? So she would, right, you go to work to get work done, where Marin is going to have a very different understanding of what work means. And that's because of our understandings of what workplace flexibility is, or workplace, so workplace flexibility, when we think about it in a broad sense, is when you have flexibility in the scheduling of your hours worked, the amount of the hours worked, and the place of that work, right? So I have a very flexible schedule. Other people, not so much. Workplace flexibility is beneficial to both the employer and the employee. For employees, they have higher mental and physical health, they are more satisfied, they're less likely to leave, and they're able to find balance a lot easier than if they didn't have workplace flexibility options. And it's beneficial to the employer. They get more creative and productive workers if they implement flexibility policies. And it's a way that they can live out their values. Because some scholarship says that workplace flexibility really is about morality, and that you can really make a difference in your workers' lives by giving them these type of flexibility options. And they say most workers, I would say it's most professional workers are offered workplace flexibility policies. I don't think, right, I talk about how the missing middle is missing, and I don't think the missing middle and the poor get the type of flexibility that other jobs get. And so most recent statistics say between 80 and 90% of workplaces offer some sort of workplace flexibility policies. Does anyone want to take a guess at how many people actually use workplace flexibility? 20? Lower. 11. Despite almost 90% of the American workforce getting workplace flexibility policies, 11% use them. And so when I got into this project, my question was why? Right? If they're so beneficial to both the workers and the organizations, why are we not using these policies? And one answer is because it's stigmatized. People become stigmatized if they use workplace flexibility policies. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You're like, well, the policy, like, what, you get in trouble for using the policies? And the reality is yes, workers do. And there's quite a bit of research to support that. But the term workplace flexibility stigma is actually a really new idea. This was first published in 2014. So it's the idea that this is actually a stigma is really new, where some scholars have been talking about the policy exists, but you can't really use it since about 2000 is one of the first. And so like, we've known about it for a while, but we haven't put a name to it. And so the stigma occurs in two ways. And a stigma is any discrediting mark. It comes from Goffman's work, and it's any discrediting mark, and it can occur in many ways, but specifically for workplace flexibility stigma, it occurs if you will receive different rewards or punishments for the perception of using the policies. And so in my research, I had one of my participants she worked in a plant, like on a physical plant, and when she would use workplace flexibility policies to take care of her children, when she would come back, she'd be given very dangerous jobs. Like she would have to go on to these really big machineries where it's really hot and you can get heat exhaustion and stroke, let alone like lose limbs, right, with the type of work she was doing. But she said she would only have to do that if she missed work leading up to it. And so, right, if there's some sort of reward or cost, that can be one way people can become stigmatized. And another way is just what the research calls general mistreatment at work, which I would call communication. Right, so it's the comments that your coworkers or your bosses might say to you. And right, so Maren was born in April, and so she was born the week of finals week. And I had comments like, well, aren't you going to come back and give your finals? No, I'm not going to come back and give my finals 2 days after I had a baby. But people expected me to. I can name at least 3 occasions where I had somebody ask if I was going to be back to finish out this semester. Right? And so despite the fact that we have national laws on the books that says I get 12 weeks off, the expectation was I would be back. And so we get these little comments, right? And little comments can start to add up to big comments. And so what we know about workplace flexibility stigma, we actually know quite a bit about the gender differences that occur. We know the differences that occur between professionals, and I hate this term, but the poor. It's literally what they're called in the research. The poor people. I was like, no, like, come on. Like, we can't come up with a better term than the poor. I hate it, but it's what they use. So what we don't know is and this is the research that calls it the missing middle. So we don't know what their experiences are like. And we don't know how that happens. Well, luckily for me, I studied communication, which, for those of you who are not communication majors or professors, communication is the process in which we create meanings. And so as someone who studies communication, I study the processes by which people make meaning within their everyday lives, right? So I study ways that we talk about identity and stigma and how that shapes the workplace, right? Where there are other people in the room who study media and who study PR and advertising. But at its core, communication is about the process of which things happen. And so I was like, communication is a really great way to kind of maybe answer this question. And so when we're thinking about communication and stigma, 2 big names kind of jump out. The first is Rachel Smith, and the second is Rebecca Meisenbach. And Rebecca Meisenbach happens to be my advisor. And so Rachel Smith created the model of stigma communication, of how do we stigmatize people in society. And so her research specifically looks at mental health and health-related stigmas, so a lot of like HIV, those type of stigmas that occur within society. But it's really looking at the stigma message, how we react to that message, and the effects of that message. And that's what Rachel Smith helped us understand. And so the stigma message, it's the communication that we first get. And the purpose of stigma communication is to socialize members of society to stigmatize other people. And so it's not necessarily looking at the people who are stigmatized, but it's more looking at culturally, how do we create these stigmatized identities? And so the first is the stigma message. And so we distinguish them as different, we label people, and we blame them for their discredited mark, and then we, we associate some sort of either physical or social peril with them. Well, you don't, right? So like with HIV, it was, well, you can't go near them. What if you get HIV? Right? So there's some sort of peril that can happen and I'm going to talk about the peril that happens with workplace flexibility stigma, but right, something bad, right, could happen if you associate with those people over there. And so then we can have message reactions. And so as we start to internalize them, and maybe our emotions or our behaviors start to change. And so right, I start to fear that group. I start to distance myself from that group. I other them, I stereotype them. I try to put them in a corner where they can't come out. Right? We're trying to create these physical barriers from that group over there that's stigmatized. And then the effects of the message. So from a general society, right, we are creating an us versus them. We're distancing ourselves. And if I'm the person who has that discrediting mark, I start to distance myself because I don't want to get that message anymore. And then Rebecca Meisenbach's work looks at how do people who are stigmatized manage that identity. And she has a lot of different ways that we can either say, yes, I do have that stigma and I'm gonna accept that stigma, or I'm gonna push back against the stigma, or I'm gonna be like, well, you're an idiot and you're wrong, this isn't actually a stigma. So there's a lot of different ways that we can manage it, but this is really the communication process that happens of how we stigmatize people. And then the other thing that's important in terms of how we think about stigma in communication is Alveston and Kerman's levels of discourse. And this is very much an organizational communication way to talk about discourse. Other comm people in this room are probably like, big D, little d, what does that mean? Where in my org comm classes, they know what little d and big D stands for, but everyone else is like, wait, what did she just say? But this is the way org comm looks at it. And so ultimately, there's 3 levels of discourse. The first is small d discourse, or the micro level discourse. And these are these everyday discussions. It's everyday conversations, right? So it's the conversations that we're having, this would be a small d discourse. So that everyday mistreatment, from a couple of slides ago, that's small d discourse. Another small d discourse is the meso-level discourses. And in ORCOM, this is typically seen as the organizational level. So it's organizational policies, it's the organizational culture, it's the norms of the organization, how all of that level of communication shapes our everyday communication. But then also these macro level discourses, which most people will just call it ideology. So what the levels of discourse help us understand is how our macro level discourses influencing organizational policies, which then influence our everyday conversations in the workplace, and vice versa, right? And because our small everyday conversations start to shape how we understand larger ideologies as well. That's right, so they all play within each other. And I wanted to at least bring this up because I'm going to talk about 3 Big D discourses quite a bit when I get into my results. And so when we're thinking about workplace flexibility and work-life balance, there's 3 main cultural ideologies at play. There's a lot at play, but these are the 3 main ones. The first is the ideal worker. This is the idea that work should come first and nothing should get in the way of work. Work is the reason that you are born and you are alive, and everything you do should be for work. And so if you start to not show up to work, you're no longer seen as that ideal worker. There's a lot of stereotypes of gender and social class associated with it. Men are always seen as more of an ideal worker than women are, because as a woman, you're going to go and have babies and just disappear for months at a time. Where men, you never have any childcare responsibilities, and you're always going to be available to work. Right? We know that that's obviously real. Not. But then very counter to it is this idea that family should come first. Well, your family is the most important thing. Your kids are the most important thing. Why, right, particularly for women, get family first. Those discourse a lot more of, wait, you're going to go back to work? You're not just going to be a stay-at-home mom and take care of your child? We still get those messages. But inherently tied in family first is pronatalism. And this is the assumption and the idea that everybody wants to have kids and should have kids, and that if you don't have kids, your life is unfulfilled. We know that's not true. But there is that assumption that when we say family, we really mean children. And that if you don't have kids, you don't have a quote-unquote family. And so those are the three main discourses that we're going to see throughout my results. And so when we're thinking about what my research questions were from this project, how, if at all, do the missing middle communicatively construct workplace flexibility via macro, meso, and micro-level discourses? And then number 2, how, if at all, is flexibility stigma communicatively constructed by the missing middle? And so again, what is flexibility stigma? How does that happen? And so I interviewed 29 people, 20 women and 9 men, ranging in ages from 22 to 59 years old. A majority had some college education. 3 people had bachelor's degrees. Everyone else had 2 years degrees, or maybe they had some before level experience. And then the lowest level of education was a GED. And the average income was $36,000 a year. It ranged from $15,000 a year to about $54,000 a year for their income. And a variety of industries. So I had some in education, I had some in corporate business, I had some construction, banking. I had a wide variety of industries that people talked about. And so I mentioned it before, but I had 29 semi-structured interviews. They ranged from 15 to 59 minutes. The average was 35. Those of you who maybe do qualitative research might say, oh, that seems kind of low on how long the interviews are. And I've actually gotten quite a bit of pushback about how short my interviews were. And so now we're having a whole debate in OrCom. There's a group of us who study social class who say that's a very classist assumption that people are just going to talk a lot. And so maybe we need to rethink what it means to have good data when you're talking to people from different social classes. And so that's a whole conversation. I get a lot of pushback there. And then I use Tracy's iterative approach to analyze the data, which basically just goes back and forth between theory and my data and back to theory and back to my data to kind of figure out what's going on. And there's a 3-step approach that she follows. And so down to the good stuff, which, I figured I was going to talk about that. That's what happens when you have a 400-page document that you condense into a 40-minute presentation. But what is workplace flexibility? And so for the missing middle, I'm going to back up for a second. So I originally went in and I just wanted to find out what was the process. How do people become stigmatized? But a weird thing happened along the way. And if you do research, things don't always go the way that you assume it's going to. And my first several interviews, I would say, so what's flexibility stigma? Or what's workplace flexibility? And they would be like, what are you talking about? Well, workplace flexibility, what is that to you? Well, what do you mean by that? So this was a term that most of my interviewees didn't really think of or know about, or know of organizational policies that even existed about it. And so I was like, now what do I do? And so I changed the interview guide. And so I then started to just even ask, what do they know about it? Have they heard of it before? And ultimately for the missing middle, where for me, workplace flexibility is that I can work from home or a coffee shop, the hours that I want to adjust. For them, it's the ability to take time off for their personal lives. So if they're sick, a child is sick, or vacation. All 29 people, that's workplace flexibility. It's not even, working from another location isn't even on their mind. But is their workplace going to work with them if they're sick or a kid is sick or they want to take vacation? It's amazing how many stories they had of their managers telling them no to vacation, which I real. Like, I guess I knew that could happen, but I didn't realize how widespread that phenomenon was. It becomes very individualized. It is not something that organizations help spread the news about. It's something that they have to figure out for themselves. And because it's so individualized, it becomes really easy to stigmatize other people if there's no kind of set version of workplace flexibility. And then, again, they use a variety of big D, little d discourses, and I'm going to, rather than talk about here are the big D discourses, here are the meso levels, and here are the micro levels, I'm just going to talk about how they intersect. And so Tracy is a housekeeper, and so she says, so you've got to have some sort of balance there. So where the management says, yes, I know you have a life outside of work, yes, I know you have kids, life happens. Some you can't control messes with you, but you're here to do a job. I hired you to be part of this team, to do a job. I didn't hire you to constantly be late and be on the phone and have every other day to do off, to do this, that, whatever. That's what your day is off for. So on one hand, she's articulating, yes, you have a life outside of work, you have kids, there's that pronatalism, right? Like, obviously, the only reason you should be taking time off is for your kids, not you, kids. But then we're also, right, you have a job. I hired you to do a job. So we're seeing kind of the conflict between family first, pronatalism, and ideal worker, right? Because how are you supposed to put work and family first? By naming something first and putting something as a priority, something obviously has to fall to second. And so it's really hard for people to say they're both equal, which is why work-life balance, it ain't a balance. Something's always going to win. So this is really getting at the pronatalism again. I don't think anyone is treated differently except for one lady that I work with who has young kids. She's been taking time off for FMLA. I know these personal things that she needs, so she's let off the hook easier than someone else who doesn't really need it. Because her reason is kids, it's more okay to use workplace flexibility, right? Doesn't really need it. Your cat, they're fine. It's not right. It's not a kid. Where a lot of I do also research on voluntarily child-free couples, and so many of those participants are like, but my pets are my kids. Like, why can't I take these policies to bring my cat to the vet, right? But it's not covered under most workplace flexibility policies, and it's certainly not covered under FMLA, which is our national policy on work life. Pets are not covered. Where if you have a pet, you're like, pets are important too. And so here is an example of intersecting meso and micro. And so Renee, who works in human resources, says, I've never worked at a place that has official flexibility policies. And I was like, what do you mean you've never? Nothing's ever been written down. And so it's been a trial of how does it work around here, asking a peer, asking a manager, what happens if I have a doctor appointment? So in this case, right, there's no meso level discourse, right? There's nothing formally written down. So the way that Renee has been able to figure out what workplace flexibility is through those small micro conversations with coworkers and with her manager to figure out what is acceptable and not acceptable, right? So if I have a doctor's appointment, what do I do? And because there's no policy in place, she then uses micro level discourses to fill in that gap. And so sometimes, right, you can see how those interplay with each other. I'm going to skip that one because I'm kind of running out of time. And so here is an example of Katrina, and she talks about 2 different organizations that she's worked at. And so it's 2 different meso-level discourses, but it's an example of kind of how all 3 kind of come together. And so I guess people could say one thing about a company versus another. For example, like at our current employer, they don't allow people to be late. Where if you go work at this big box retailer that she was working at, they might say, like, oh, well, those people, they allow you to be at least like 10 minutes late. So as long as you're there within 10 minutes, you're okay. But I guess her current employer is more negative. If we're 2 minutes late, where the big box retailer is like, meh. So the meso level is right. It's the idea of an ideal worker is someone who is there on time, right? Showing up late means you are not an ideal worker. So although she's not saying it, she's using it as a resource to explain, right? Because if you're a good worker, you'd show up on time. Where the meso level, one has a formal policy of if you are late, you are late, versus one is a little bit more relaxed. And then that shaped how her coworkers talked about it. The place that was more strict, her coworkers were more strict if you were not here on time, versus the place that was a little bit more lenient, the coworkers were also more lenient. And so we kind of see how they all kind of play off of one with one another. And so what does it mean for what is workplace flexibility for the missing middle? It's a give and take relationship. These people really kind of see it as, well, I might be late one day, but I'll stay late another day. If I'm going to give everything to my employer, I expect at some point I'm going to get something back. And I heard that kind of repeatedly over and over. We need to have a broader definition of policy because they didn't even know these policies existed. So that's a problem if you're an HR manager, that if your employees don't even know about policies, you're clearly not communicating about them. And I hit this on everything I do, is organizations need to rethink how they define family. If we just look at family as kids, we are missing a whole bunch of people's lives. And not only that, what if I want the day off? Just so I can, right, we call them mental health days. Right, what if it's like, no, I just want to go get a massage and I want to take a nap. Like, where's my wellness in this? And so I think we need to rethink what family is. And I'm going to really briefly go through this of how this process happens, because it's the part of my dissertation that's still very much in flux. I need to get more data on this to really kind of fill in some of the holes of the process. But ultimately in this research, what kind of happened is that using workplace flexibility was not always stigmatized, right? Sometimes it was totally right. We all have lives outside of work. Everyone uses it at different times. It's more of, okay, you're using it today, I'll use it next week. However, when it became stigmatized, it was very stigmatized. These workers, right, so my one participant who got put to the really dangerous jobs by her manager, like when it became, it's a really big trigger. And what happens is because the perception is that they are abusing the policy. It's okay to use it, but you can't abuse it. And so so the labeling, they would be perceived as lazy. This was a question I asked, so when does someone become stigmatized? It depends on their behaviors and personalities. Because the people that are abusing it, well, they're lazy workers. Okay, so I'm labeling you. That Stigma communication message, I'm now labeling you as different. You are lazy. You are not an ideal worker. And so, we're starting that process of becoming stigmatized. If you're perceived of using it too much, right? If you are using these policies too much, is there a magic number? Once, this many times, is this when we start judging you? Probably not. Because in that first day or two, it's totally fine. But then it seems to happen once a week, or the third time in a month. Because it feels like there's some sort of number. That's before this you're fine and we understand it, but after this, we don't understand and you're using it excessively. So there's some sort of fine line that nobody was able to articulate of when it's from you're using it to you are abusing it. And I think part of it, and I think this might be is whether or not your excuses are perceived as legitimate or not. And ultimately, a legitimate excuse was kids. And an unlegitimate excuse is basically anything else. So there are a couple individuals that I know have abused it, because there's a certain individual that calls in sick every once in a while. Then you find out a little later that they went and did something else that day and just said that they were sick. I've heard this from other coworkers, and this particular coworker gets talked to. I actually didn't want to come in that day, so I just called in sick. So when it's so individualized, it's so easy to judge other people and say, well, that's not a legitimate excuse to use it. And where I want to go in this research is tying it to mental health. Mental health, right, having depression or anxiety or a lot of other different disorders are also stigmatized in society. And so if you're going to be stigmatized as being a lazy worker, do you say, oh, well, I have depression and I couldn't get out of bed this morning? Is that going to be perceived as a legitimate excuse? And so kind of which stigma would you rather have associated with you, right? Would you rather have, I'm a bad worker, or would you rather be known as the lady with depression? And so where I want to move this research next, on my next, once I kind of get these things out the door and published, my next step that I want to do is kind of how do we use different stigmas to kind of counter each other, and really looking at mental health and workplace flexibility, because as someone who struggles with mental health issues on my own and for my family, I can see how difficult it can be to really navigate those struggles when you have multiple stigmatized identities. And then how do you intersect and make them all kind of work together to create your balance? That's the process that I am very much not getting very far in. I will eventually. So what does this mean? So Barker says that this is a form of concerted control. So we don't have policies in place, but your coworkers are gonna, and some people talk like, well, we'll police our own, right? So Dave calls in too many times, I'm gonna just start talking to Dave. Like, you need to start coming to work. And if he doesn't, I start to exclude him from my group, right? So maybe it's not the manager, it's not the policy itself, but you can start to exclude your coworkers because they're not falling in line. And that's what Barker calls concerted control. Ultimately, the managers are the linchpin. If you have a good manager, my participants, for flexibility, it was so easy to manage. Right? They could call in sick and the manager didn't care. But if you had a tough manager, a mean manager, a manager who didn't care, it made your work-life balance much more difficult. And so I think sometimes we overlook how important that manager is. And a lot of managers don't get formal training on these type of policies and how to communicate effectively with their employees. And so I think there needs to be a lot more training with mid-level management on how to be a good manager in regards to this. And the policies are not enough. We need to look at organizational cultures and issues of power and issues, because policies are not going to be enough if societal level discourses still say work needs to be number one. And so that is all I have for you. Yeah, got in that 45-minute time. And so now if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Great. You mentioned about the stigma for possibly overusing the work flexibility. There is no magic number, although people have some type of stigma for using too much. But is there any possibility there is reverse stigma where those people have million reasons to take the flexibility, but they decide not to for a number of reasons? Like, is there any people say this person is a workaholic, so that is not necessarily a good thing? So, what's your take on that?
Well, in the U.S., being a workaholic is applauded, right? Like, we are systems in place. We reward people who are workaholics. right? They're the people who get more promotions. They're the people who get more raises. They're the people who move up in the company. And there's a lot of research out there that supports that in the US, we putting work first is what we want. There's some really interesting research done by Stacey Wieland, who looked at similar things in Sweden. And in Sweden, it's just as stigmatized to be a workaholic as it is to be seen as a bad worker. And so they have to navigate, right, that if they stayed past 44 hours a week, they would get docked in pay. Because it's more of a cultural norm, and they call it legume. I don't know Swedish, that might be right, that might be completely off. But and it's this idea of like just right. And so I think that is very much tied into cultural discourses and cultural capital Big D discourses. And in the US, we applaud workaholic. Like, we want you to be, right? Bosses want you to be a workaholic. Right? Because then that means you're being the most productive. Even though we know it's not true, but the perception is that then you're the most productive. Yeah.
Well, how does productivity kind of play into this? Because in academe, if you're not here, it doesn't mean you're not productive. But if you're on a factory line and you're out, somebody's got to put in place, or that affects the coworker.
Yeah, and so that's a big part of it. That so this is, I think it kind of, no, it might not actually be in here. But right, so the idea of if you're gone, does someone else cover for you? Or if you're gone, does that mean you just have to do your work another day? And I think that's that would play a big role in it, right? Like, it'd be different if, like, I'm sick for a week, like, maybe someone covers my classes, but I still have to do my grading. Like, I still have to do my research. No one else is going to write my even though that would be awesome if someone wants to write my research for me. But, right, so, like, there is that sense of where, like, when I was working at Microsoft, if I wasn't there to answer the queue, someone else was. And so, right, my coworkers then would have to pick up my slack. And I think that's when we see more of these little microaggressions happening, where, right, if I'm just gone from USI, like, they would be like, oh, are you okay? And nothing would really come out of it until maybe my, like, third-year review that I submitted last week, or my FAR, that we have to submit an annual report of, like, you haven't done anything all year. Like, what is going, right? And so I think it's kind of like, when do we have these check-ins for productivity? And in some, right, and so I think it's very dependent on the field and the type of industry, I would imagine. I don't know if I even answered your question, but yeah.
You mentioned that there's a gender difference in stigma. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? I think you had this slide, yeah.
Yeah. So women get treated worse across the board when workplace flexibility stigma gets triggered. For men, you are stigmatized if you are going against any ideal of hegemonic masculinity. So you want to go take care of your kid, you're going to become stigmatized. And it's very social class related. So professional men, yeah, you are a wonderful dad. Like, you are going to go and watch your son. Like, look at how amazing you are. Where for the poor men, it hits against their hegemonic masculinity. And there's actually a lot of research that so lower class men are more likely to call in sick or just quit their jobs completely than they would admit to having to take care of their children. They would rather quit because for poor, like the lower class, you can jump from job to job, right? It's not necessarily a career trajectory, right? It's, right, you go from working at McDonald's going to work at Burger King or something, right? The hits in time doesn't matter. But if you have a career trajectory, then it can. And for women, right? So there's a strong flexibility stigma if for women, right? If you like you leave early to take care of your kid, where for men it's like for professional men it's like yay, but for women it's like you should be here. And there's a lot, and then for lower women in particular, any violation of workplace flexibility, and you're gonna be seen as incompetent. You're gonna be seen as, but you're also then seen as a bad mother, that you're not seen as professional women, right? So, oh, your kid is sick. Well, why don't you have a daycare lined up? And so so you get hit as a bad worker, but then you also get hit as being a bad mom. And it's like, well, how are you supposed to plan for these? But it's kind of like you get a double hit. And so, yeah, all this comes from Williamson, Blair Loy, and Berdahl in 2014. This article just kind of blew my mind, because I was like, one, they already did what I wanted to do in my dissertation, and that's always a really sad thing. You're like, someone already did my project. But then I was like, oh my god, this is so interesting. And at that point, no one had done anything in missing middle, so they just kind of guessed. They're like, well, we think it might be this, but we don't actually know.
You know, I think in terms of career changes. So I've worked for years in broadcasting, so more of a typical set schedule kind of work and lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got into academe, and then suddenly, that was all very different.
Mm-hmm.
And still, I still think in terms of much more of that kind of work structure and,
Well, we're socialized into it at a very early age, right? We don't really think about why are our school days 8 to 3. And the reason our school days are 8 to 3 is so we can train our little workers to go be worker bees in the factory from 8 to 5 every day. We train 5-year-olds to already have the mindset that you work 8 to 5. And there's a lot of research of this is why we set up our educational system the way that we did, is that we could already train our little worker bees to go work and not even question the 8 to 5 mentality. But right, and so it's when you get outside of that, it's so my sister, she finally graduated. She's been on kind of all over the place with careers and things, and so she finally graduated with her bachelor's degree in December. And at that point, she was doing an internship all her last semester, and so she was doing 8 to 4:30 internship. And even though she was going to go work at the same place as soon as she graduated, she couldn't go work until the state license came through, because she's an addictions counselor. So she had to wait for the license to go through, even though she was doing the exact same thing. The only difference is, as an internship to worker, she had 6 weeks that she couldn't work. That's how long it took for the license. And it happened to me when I was home for Christmas. And by day 2, she had already cleaned her entire house. She was cleaning my mom's entire house. And then the next week she went and cleaned my dad's entire house. Because from the age of 5 up until that point, you work 8 to 5. And so she had no idea what to do with herself in those 6 weeks that she didn't have work, because we're just socialized at such a young age that you work 8 to 5. And so for people who don't have those hours, it can get really complicated. Any other questions?
I guess so we have some flexibility, but I find if I work from home, I feel guilty, oh my gosh,
Mm-hmm.
I should be at the office. What am I not doing because I'm not yet,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of guilt with that. And then when we have our summer break, we've got all this work to do, but we have even more flexibility.
Yeah.
And then I'm always feeling oh my gosh, I should be doing something.
And then I get nothing done.
Yeah, because they're always I know.
And then it's the last week of summer, and I'm oh man, I have all the stuff I was gonna do.
Yeah, so we waste a lot of time feeling guilty,
Mm-hmm.
waste a lot of time not adjusting, trying to figure out what should I be doing. So do you have any advice for them?
No, mom guilt is real, right? So, me search, right, we study what we don't understand. Well, I've been studying work life now for at least 5 years, but I've been a mom for 9 months. And I'm like, I thought I would know, like, how to handle this. I failed completely miserable. Like, last semester was so rough. Right, because it's like, I'm here and I feel guilty. And then I'm at home and I feel guilty that I'm not working. And then, right, it's like, and this week in particular, my husband's been out of town. He's in Arizona for a boys' golf trip. And so I've been doing, like, single parenting for the week. And I'm like, I don't know how people do this. Like, I truly do not know how to do this. And Maren's been really cranky, and daycare thought for sure she had an ear infection. So I've been waiting for a phone call all day, and like, okay, like, yeah, she's too, you need to come get her. Because even this morning they thought, they're like, okay, we'll try and see how she does today, but know that, like, I think thinking through how to handle the guilt, I mean, know that everyone has it, right? We know that. I think there's a lot of research about setting boundaries, right? And so saying, okay, and particularly some academics have really good success of, okay, I work 9 to 2, and then or whenever school gets out, and then from school gets out to bedtime, then I'm parent, and then if there's something that's going to get done after they go to bed, then I'll go back to work. And so rather than doing a second shift, it's almost like a third shift and a fourth shift and a fifth shift. Just trying to, like, I don't have an answer because I feel guilty all of the time. Like, I went to the Angela Davis talk on Wednesday, and so yesterday I left early to pick her up from daycare because I was like, I didn't get to see you yesterday. Let's hang out. And then she was a complete monster and cried all night. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't have picked you up. And then she like sees Matt on Snapchat and was like, "Hi," and I'm like, I'm telling he's not here. And then she's like, Maddie's not there. I'm like, I don't know what to do anymore. I was like, yeah, I thought I would be a little more prepared because this is what I studied. And complete fail last semester, yeah.
I wonder also if there's a difference between like job and career, right?
Yeah.
So you were talking about the trajectory. So in terms of like workplace flexibility, I wonder if those feelings of guilt are different in terms of a person who has a career, who like have particular perhaps loyalty towards a corporation, and they see this as, if I take this will be detrimental long term to my career, versus if I take these days off and I lose this job, well, it's just a job, it's not my career.
Right, that's kind of what some of these the class differences kind of are, right? That, well, if I lose this job, I don't really care. Right, but that career, and also a lot of, it's probably no surprise, but like a lot of the research about what we know about work-life balance is based on white families and white middle to upper class families who are mostly career trajectory, right? And so we don't know a lot about, well, this is just a job, I don't really care if I lose this job, it's just to pay my bills. And the reason I pay my bills is because I love my family, so like I don't really care. And so yeah, I would imagine there's a big correlation between job versus career.
Okay, well, thank you very much.